Before starting the second part of our consultations, of our conference, I'd like to inform you that at 18 hours, you are all kindly invited to the Investigative Journalism Award Ceremony, and that the award ceremony will start with a panel discussion about the media's role in building resilient society. I promise you, the panel will be extremely interested because chief editors of news agencies, leading news websites, as well as the general director of national broadcaster will attend the panel discussion. Afterwards, we will award the winners prize. We will award the winners of the competition, investigative journalism competition that was held this year in Vilnius the first time. So much I wanted to say, and now the floor is for the third panel.
Hello and welcome. This will be the last discussion of the day. But before we start, I'm not sure if you noticed during the break on the screen there were some images going around. And this is a little project that Vilniaus Institute for Policy Analysis is doing. It's called Pack of Lies, or in Lithuanian it's called Melumaišelis, and you can follow it on Facebook or Dezinfo portal. And it gives you every week or so a nice visualization of how does disinformation work. So I hope you're all well caffeinated and full of questions for our panelists. My name is Lukas Andriukaitis. I'm associate analyst with Vilniaus Institute for Policy Analysis. I'm also working as a researcher for Atlantic Council's DFR lab. Today I'll be moderating the discussion, the impact of technology and new threats in the virtual domain. So let me say a few words about our panelists. The first one is Rolf Radheim. He's a principal scientist at the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence. He has an extensive academic experience, hands-on analyzing disinformation and focusing on robot trolling currently. Urve Eslas, a former advisor to the president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. She's currently working with SIPA. Professor Dmitry Adamski. He's the head of the BA honors track in strategy and decision making at the University of IDC Herzliya in Israel. In addition to his academic career, he has extensive experience in Israel Ministry of Defense and IDF. And lastly, Vaidas Aldžiūnas, who's a defense editor in Delphi, one of the news media outlets here in Lithuania, and he's one of the most prominent defense journalists tracking hands-on disinformation in Lithuania. So a few words, a few housekeeping rules before we start. We'll start with every panelist for 10 minutes giving their opening remarks. Then we'll have a discussion, and I'll try my best to hold 20 minutes for the audience to have some questions. So please hold your questions for the end of the discussion. And without further ado, Rolf, would you mind? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas, and everybody else for inviting me back to Vilnius. It's great to be here. I'm going to save this slide another second. Lucas introduced me as somebody who's working on robo-trolling, which I think is great because that's basically a word we made up 2 years ago because we were interested in what robots and trolls are doing in social media. So one of the bosses at the center decided, yeah, let's call this robo-trolling, and it seems to have stuck, so we go with that. I work at the technical branch, where we do a lot of data science research, where we pull in a lot of numbers and data from the internet, and crunch that to try to find out what's going on social media platforms at the moment. And I want to just draw together a few findings from some ongoing projects we have. The first is this robo-trolling report, which you can find on our website. I've got about 10 copies, which I'll leave somewhere as well. And we publish this 4 times a year. We've been up to the 5th issue now. It looks at automated activity and troll activity about the NATO presence in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. And it's been doing pretty well. The other thing I want to talk about is an experiment we've just finished where we took out a lot of ads on Facebook to try to figure out, are there strange things happening on that platform as well? So see how it goes. The main thing I want you to take away from this session today is that if we are serious about tackling the problems of trolls and bots online, we need to persuade businesses that automated activity on social media platforms is costing them a lot of money through fake clicks on ads, through traffic that they are being charged for but don't realize is actually completely fake. Because we can complain about what the Russians, what the Kremlin is doing on social media platforms, but unless it's going to actually hurt the platform's bottom line, you probably won't see too big differences being made. This is a problem that they can tackle if they want to. We all know this. Our inboxes used to be full of spam. So 10, 15 years ago, suddenly junk mail is a thing of the past. I don't even remember the last time I had to go to look for a good message in my spam box. It's gotten so good. Yet social media platforms are just full of the social media equivalent of email spam. So we need to persuade them to deal with that problem. These are the headline figures we published in our most recent robo-trolling report. And what I want you to take from this is that English language spaces, they're kind of functioning pretty okay. Other language spaces, not so much. Which tells us, Twitter in this case, they're investing pretty heavily in making the English language spaces good, and they've not done as much for other language spaces. This is not just that people are only interested in manipulating Russian language social media platforms. It is that the algorithms, the training data, the approaches taken by the social media companies do not work well for languages other than English.
What are these percentages for?
These percentages are the proportion of messages about NATO in the Baltic states and Poland, which we think come from accounts that are predominantly automated. Which is to say, the Russian space continuously for the last year and a half has been dominated by this sort of fake activity. I'm not talking about trolls, I'm talking about computer programs that are just automatically churning out messages. The other thing to bear in mind about this is that bot activity is dynamic. It comes in waves. Last year, around about this time, 85% of messages about Estonia came from bot accounts. Today, that's down to about 40%, but it varies up and down. When we look at the manipulations on social media platforms, there are 2 main types that are of interest. There's automated accounts and there's human-controlled troll accounts. Automated accounts on the left-hand side, that might be like the BBC's page, which automatically messages about new articles on the website. That's kind of good automation, that's an efficiency saving, that's what we want to see. On the other hand, you've got characters like Jana, whose account was more or less for sale, and she just tweeted anything that she was paid to put out there. So this is essentially a fake citizen that's being run by a computer program to manipulate the public conversation. And on the right-hand side, troll accounts that are just anonymous. We have no idea who operates these. And what we've seen is that last year, this graph doesn't go back as far as I'd want. If it could go back further, the yellow line would be up, way off the chart. But last year, bot activity was all over the place on Twitter. Bot activity was by far problem number 1 we were seeing about messaging around the NATO presence. But then around about January, these anonymous accounts, they started dominating this space. And I think the explanation for this is pretty simple. Twitter has been investing in cleaning up their platform, and they've done that predominantly by tackling automated bot accounts. as you can see, the problem has not gone away. The yellow line and the blue line, they pretty much tag along. But today, we're seeing a huge amount of activity from fake anonymous accounts, in addition to the trolling activity. So, when we, a few pages ahead in my notes, when we present this, people usually say, this is great, but in Lithuania, 3% of the population use Twitter. What does this actually speak to? And that's kind of a good point. I think it speaks to what the Kremlin propaganda is doing, which is relevant in itself. But we were keen to look what is happening on platforms where users are more present. So we wanted to do something with Facebook. And we figured that the best way to do that was to take out a series of ads. Because if you advertise on Facebook, they give you a lot of data. Whereas if you're a researcher trying to study the platform, they give you nothing whatsoever. So we figured this was the best entry point. And what we did was we took out 64 ads on Facebook, which ran at the end of August. This is the first time we're presenting on this. It's quite exciting, really. And we sent some messages in Russian, some in English. We put some on Twitter. We put some on Facebook. It was structured in sort of a matrix so that we were doing a fair test across the different platforms, targeting different audiences. And the way the ad worked was we promoted our latest report. If this showed up on your feed, you'd be encouraged to click on it. If you clicked on it, you would get to this page on our website, which says, click here to read our report. That's really all you have to do as a normal human user to access the content, which is then right behind that click. Why did we add in that click on our website? Because when I looked at the website logs for our Facebook advertising campaigns, I saw thousands of clicks from places I wouldn't expect them, like Kazakhstan and Libya and Algeria and Tajikistan, the Philippines, places where the NATO presence in the Baltics and Poland might not be the most important issue. So we thought, maybe this is fake. Maybe we can filter it out somehow. And that's basically what we then did with this step. So then we could identify who are the users who arrive on our website and do nothing, and who are the users who go onto the report. And this analysis showed more or less what we would expect. Users who came from Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Slovakia, about 50% of them went on to read the report. That sort of makes sense. You can understand why somebody might click on it and then lose interest before they've gotten very far in the process. But then towards the bottom end of this list, you've got Algeria, Bangladesh, Azerbaijan, Libya, Iraq, Tunisia, and Tajikistan, all of which have a click-through rate of about 0.2%. In other words, none of these users from those countries were getting to our content. But the thing is, these are clicks that Facebook were charging us quite a lot of money for. We spent 2,000 euros on this project. So we're not totally happy with that. And this is what it looks like when we visualize where our users went. How am I doing, Lucas? Another 2 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
So when we got the bill from Facebook, they charged us for 21,000 clicks on newsfeed, supposedly from organic Facebook users. The first bar here, the green one, these are Facebook users who actually never left Facebook after they clicked it. The most likely explanation here is it's a computer script that's just harvesting all the links on the page and checking where do these links point. This is something we do ourselves in the work we do at the center. So 9,400 of the clicks that Facebook billed us for, they never got anywhere. Like, this is, to me, this is very close to like fraud, essentially. This is not happy with Facebook. Then the next band here, these are users who made it to our page, but who Google have identified as somehow being dodgy. So these are from IP addresses that are known spammers or otherwise engaged in fraud. We looked up a large sample of these, and it's not great. Like, it's pretty easy to identify that this is inauthentic activity. And quite tellingly, actually, these are clicks that that Google do not charge their customers for. So Google just didn't even count these because they were so fake. The next bit is the last 3,300 users who made it to our page, but who actually didn't choose to click on the report. We don't know for sure that they were fake. We think quite a lot of them were, because there were still a lot of people from Libya and Algeria among those that passed the Google test. But kind of the bottom line really is that there's only 219 of those 21,000 users who reached the report. I don't know that they read the report, right? But at least they loaded it. Our website logs show that the page was accessed, which translates to about 1%. So that's a phenomenally poor rate. Now, we designed this experiment in a really careful, controlled way that you wouldn't do unless you were suspicious that this might be going on. So people wouldn't really realize that this is happening. We've been advertising our products on Facebook before, and our marketing folks are quite happy to take the numbers to the director and say, look, this is great. We're getting all these users from Facebook. It's fantastic. And everybody kind of wins here. Facebook gets the ad revenue. Marketers get to sell these services. I get to take the report to the director and say, robo-trolling is the most popular thing on our website. Can I have that raise, please? Nobody loses except whoever is paying for the ads. Now, when we deal with Kremlin propaganda and Kremlin hostile messaging on the platform, I showed you the numbers from Twitter, 49%. Most of that is not coming from the Kremlin. It's just really low-quality spam. If we want to be able to tackle the targeted stuff, the 1% that has a high impact and is hard to detect, we need to be able to clear the room from the other 48% that's just making it noisy. Like the spam analogy again, right? I remember losing emails from people that I should have seen because my inbox was full of spam and I just deleted everything. This is kind of the equivalent. We need to get rid of the spam so that we can actually focus on the real problem here, which is the targeted information operations. And how do we do that? We do that by tackling this whole click fraud industry with all this sort of gray zone, social media, optimization, marketing, all the sites that offer to sell you likes, followers, clicks, retweets, etc. We have to tackle all of that in order to get at the political stuff. At the moment, the social media companies want to deal with the political stuff in isolation. I think that will not work. So that's why, with this project, we will be calling on businesses to look at where their advertising money is going and to maybe see, could they put some pressure on the social media companies to get value for their investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf. Quite fascinating. Urve, would you mind?
Thank you, Lucas. Just one correction. Current advisor of a former president. Otherwise, it was good. So I will first give a very brief overview on different attack vectors that foreign actors are using. And after that, I hope I manage to also offer some solutions. So we have seen foreign actors influencing meddling into Western democratic processes, at least since 2014. And it has happened everywhere, not only in Europe, but also states and other non-European countries. It has been rather difficult to keep a track, but Toronto University has counted about 18 such attempts in 2014-2017. In some cases, the evidence that behind these attacks were Russia are more clear, in some cases less clear. But there are one thing which is very similar in almost all cases. Apparently they all, or almost all, use the same or similar attack vectors. So what are those attack vectors? In almost every case we have seen hacking, doxing. Doxing is leaking hacked or stolen documents to media to be published. Bots, trolls, dark ads, and of course, disinformation. And in most of the cases, those tools were used to fuel tension in societies and create divide. So none of, or most of these methods were not possible 10 years ago. And there's little or no regulations yet on this area. And another interesting thing is that those attack vectors, as I said, are used globally. And in many countries, we have seen the very similar bad actors. For example, I think that everybody in Europe and in America knows who are APT 28 and APT 29. But yet, the responses of the democratic countries are remained mostly local. So the threat is global, but responses are still local. So the first thing would be that we definitely would need a more coordinated approach. President Ilves has proposed that we need a sort of cyber NATO, a cyber defense alliance that includes members from other parts of the world as well, as cyber threats recognize no borders. The similar idea was previously proposed also by former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and late US Senator John McCain. So forming such an alliance would give the Western democracies much more coordinated approach that we desperately need right now. So yesterday you probably noticed that the European Commission proposed measures for securing free and fair elections. And this is a very good start. But at the same time, as I said, the problem is wider than just Europe and wider than just NATO. But some solutions are far more simple. For example, parties and candidates must use far more secure communication technologies. Two-factor authentication is absolutely must. For example, in the US Democratic National Committee hack, 126 people of 128 people with access to the server used two-factor authentication. Two did not. So moving forward, concerning doxing, leaking documents to media organizations to being published, I think that here we face kind of weird problem. It's usually very well recognized that none of a respectful media organization would publish anything that is stolen from someone's desk. But at the same time, it seems to be quite normal, considered quite normal, to publish something that is stolen online. So these things should also have rules. All what is not allowed offline shouldn't be allowed online as well. So this is an agreement, I think, that the media organizations should make, that they will not publish any leaked private emails. Doesn't matter how many clicks they would generate. Now, next, attack vector concerning social media. As we have seen, it has become the primary factor in political campaigns. And approximately 2/3 of people have said, according to surveys, that they use social media as a first source of their news. In 3 months, just one example, in 3 months leading up to US presidential elections, Facebook users shared some 8.7 million fake stories, and significant amount more than real stories were shared. Also, thousands of dark ads, highly individualized political advisements, made based algorithms processed big data, were used to target voters, some paid by Russia. Regarding bots and trolls, Twitter suspended more than 70 million accounts this summer alone, many of which were active as bots and trolls. As we saw at Twitter and Facebook testifying before the US Congress last week, the social media companies have admitted the problem and are interested in solving it and changing their policies. I think they have a very good reason to be concerned. If social media companies are not able to regulate themselves, they most probably will be regulated by governments. it is quite clear that neither dark gods have place in transparent modern democracies, nor do bots and trolls. Doesn't matter what kind of information they share. So some might ask that, what about free speech, freedom of speech? Isn't that one of the rights we have to protect no matter what? I remember Anne Applebaum wisely said once that, you know, freedom of speech, as other human rights, are meant for humans and not for anonymous trolls and bots. And I think she was quite right. But all those issues are relatively easy to solve, I should say, either by better cyber hygiene or by laws and regulations. But in my opinion, the biggest threat lies beyond that, beyond those active measures. And these issues concern rather social aspects. More generally, the question of free will. In past few years, I have noticed two different approaches to active measures. The first one is, I would say, plainly technological approach. It says that influencing any target groups, any individual, would be quite easy if you have a sufficient amount of money, sufficient amount of data, well-written algorithms, and enough time. So if you have all these, you can basically win any elections. The viewpoint was represented, for example, by Steve Bannon, former Trump strategist, who wants now to unite European populists. But he's not the first one and not the only one. Already in 1998, Russian Infowars specialist Sergei Rostorguyev wrote a book called Informationная война, Information War. And there he stated that basically human mind is not that much different from computer. So just like viruses can be inserted into computers, you can insert information virus into human mind. So basically, according to him, again, if you have a sufficient amount of time, money, and data, you can win any elections possible. And there's no chance that those people you want to influence can be refused to be influenced. Fortunately, things are not that simple. This approach, for example, does not explain why during Soviet times, even though Russia targeted Estonian people for 50 years, it was still very difficult to change our minds. There's several different reasons why what happened so. I would say that disco and the Finnish TV were two of the main components, perhaps. But still, this is a good example why this technological approach really doesn't work. So another, more sociological approach says that disinformation should be seen as any kind of communication. So communication contains at least three aspects: a sender, a message, and a receiver. So for now, most of think tanks and most of research groups have concentrated either on the sender, what Russia wants, what it thinks, what it does, or the message, what kind of information it sends out. But it's a rather funny thing. Of course, those two aspects are extremely important to understand what is happening at all. But the funny thing about communication is that it only functions if all those three aspects are present. So if you eliminate one of them or made it less active, the communication cannot take part. So basically, there's not much we can do about the sender. And there's not much we can do about the message instead of understanding it. But there is something we can do with sender. So we can make them less vulnerable to disinformation. And this is something I think we should concentrate more. Because even though, as I said, studying both Russia and its messages is extremely important, Still, there is a threat where we start to, so said, admiring the problem instead of solving it. But at the same time, if we try to focus more to make those vulnerable target group less vulnerable, so it would be probably an approach to make things better. So, but to do that, we should first know who are the vulnerable target groups. As we heard today, according to Ukrainian PRISM resilience report, this is actually a very good paper. I recommend everybody to read it. In Central and Eastern Europe, in most cases, the local Russian-speaking minorities who live in Russian information space are vulnerable ones. But also elderly people who feel strong nostalgia for the communist past, and also far-right, far-left groups, anti-EU and anti-NATO groups. In many cases, their vulnerability at least is partly caused by the weaker position in societies. For example, one thing I remember and find quite remarkable about this report is that, for example, in Slovakia, both elderly people and people under 25 feel that they are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So Russia did not cause this disadvantage, but Russia very well knows how to exploit it. So to wrap up very, very quickly, first, we really need a cyber alliance of democratic countries, as proposed by Ilves, Albright, and McCain. Second, we need better practices on cyber hygiene. Third, we need new regulations for big tech companies if they do not manage to regulate themselves. And fourth, we need to concentrate on local vulnerable target groups to build up information resilience. So probably there are much more what we should do and we can do, but this would be a good start.
Thank you, Urve. The next one, Professor Dimitri.
Okay, Laba diena. Good afternoon. It's very good to be here. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Let me take you all a little bit aside to the Israeli experience. I'm coming from Israel. I'm doing quite a lot of research on this issue, and that's exactly what I'm going to offer for you as food for thought right now. Why actually Israel? How is it related to the main topic of interest for all of us? Well, Israel is traditionally considered to be quite often for national security professionals as frame of reference for military innovations or security innovations. And also right now, Israel is considered to be among the leading cyber powers around the world. So the question is how Israeli experience can actually offer you or either food for thought or just stimulate your thinking on the issues that we are discussing. The event is actually looking at the issues of information and technology and their strategic outcomes of this informational technology, whether we're talking about the cyber issues, as you just mentioned, or more cognitive psychological aspects of informational technology. In the Israeli case, it is impossible to understand the Israeli cyber innovation without understanding the broader context of Israeli approach to innovations. As we know, cyber is a relatively young phenomenon, so it was incepted in Israel as part of the broader Israeli approach to innovations in military affairs. So let me just take you very briefly through 10 main insights that explain and characterize Israeli approach to innovation. In fact, what I'm offering to you is just a synthesis of sociology of Israeli approach to innovations as it is appearing in academic literature, mainly in international relations and strategic studies literature, and that's where I'm actually coming from. Well, all of us know that from its establishment, Israel, the state of Israel, on purpose built itself as a military-industrial power and innovator. It is considered to be a story of success. What accounts for the Israeli success? My argument is very straightforward. It's actually a combination of two factors: geopolitical structural factors and also cultural organizational factors that condition Israeli approach to innovations. By the way, each and every one of them is a necessary but insufficient condition for their eventual successful outcome. So let me take you through these 10 characteristics of Israeli approach to innovation. I will start from geopolitical structural, and then I will move to organizational cultural. All right, the first structural issue. From the beginning, in the State of Israel, and we just celebrated 70 years of independence of the State of Israel, there is a social consensus and social belief that there is a clear necessity to excel in national security affairs. That's actually the pledge for survival. That's the first and the most basic assumption that is shared by most of the citizens. For that reason, there is a very wide public support for allocation of resources to defense sector. That's point number one. Point number two, Israeli self-perception in the region from the beginning was the self-perception of few against many. By the way, it doesn't really matter to what extent this is correct or not, but that's a fact of life. That's the way how Israelis saw themselves from the beginning. It's a very clear siege mentality, a perception that the whole world is against us, and perception that we are operating from the position of material strategic asymmetry. In other words, we are always doomed to be in the situation when we are materially, in terms of the territory, manpower, national resources, and strategic depth, we're going to be inferior to our adversaries. And we're also operating from the position of strategic asymmetry. In other words, we are unable, due to our material inferiority, to impose our strategic will on the other side by the force of military power, in contrast to our enemies. In other words, our enemies can basically destroy us totally. We are unable to do that. We don't want to do that, but we are also unable to do that. That's point number two. That means that we are actually doomed to be in the indefinite number of military rounds with our enemies. That's one of the basic assumptions of the Israeli founding fathers. Sounds very pessimistic, right? But there comes the third point, the optimistic one. How do you actually survive in this situation? And the main Israeli solution from the start to outperform its superior adversaries was very asymmetrical. Israel perceives itself as an asymmetrical actor. I know that your association with asymmetry is slightly different, but in that case, that's exactly the asymmetry. The asymmetrical Israeli solution is the so-called qualitative military edge. That's the term that is introduced in the colloquial Hebrew. It maybe sounds slightly strange in English, but qualitative military edge, QME, stands for three things. We are offering qualitative countermeasure to quantitative superiority by having higher level of weaponry, in other words, higher level of technology, higher level of the manpower, and higher level of conceptual doctrinal thinking in strategic affairs, if you want the stratagem. By the way, historically, if you are tracing the way how Israelis were thinking about qualitative military edge, in the beginning, all three components, the technological one, the human one, and the conceptual one, were relatively balanced. Also due to the fact that in the beginning, Israel wasn't a technological superpower. With the time, the technological component basically downgraded the soft ones, the conceptual and the human. So today when you talk to Israeli practitioners and they talk to you about qualitative military edge, mainly they talk about technology. That brings me to point number 4. From the beginning, Israel, driven by the very fundamental sense of insecurity and siege mentality, and my prime minister visited this country a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was very clear in his remarks, the main lessons that the state of Israel learned from the Holocaust, never again, and we should be self-sufficient, because there is no one to rely upon. So this formative experience of Holocaust actually left a very significant imprint on Israeli defense industry. Israel, where possible, and the more the better, is trying to be self-sufficient and self-reliant in military technology. That accounts for the very significant industrial military sector that Israel established from the beginning. By the way, in some cases, it almost brought the whole country to the bankruptcy. There was a moment in history when Israel decided to build its own airplane. It's also costed us the collapse of the Israeli economy in the 80s. But eventually, the outcome is disproportionately big, but very wisely managed military-industrial complex. fifth, and probably the most important structural point, from the beginning, Israeli leadership until this very day designated, or to be more precise, produced a very vibrant national ecosystem of national security. In other words, when Israeli decision makers are talking about national security, they're not talking only about the military part of it. They're talking about education, science, technology, private sector, and public sector. So the founding fathers producing this strong military-industrial sector, they were thinking about as something that can produce second and third order effects on the Israeli society and economics. That's why when you talk about national security or defense technological sector in Israel, it basically encapsulates private, public, educational, and also technological sectors. So if you wish, it's a broad approach to national security, much broader than in many NATO countries, or much broader than in Russia, or in the United States, for the sake of argument. So these are 5 structural factors. It is impossible, however, to understand Israeli innovative approach without organizational cultural factors that condition Israeli approach to innovation. Let me take you around through these 5. First of all, their basic Israeli self-perception, the cultural self-perception of Israelis, they see themselves as assertive, flexible about rules, plans, and regulations, basically casual about rules, laws, and regulations, and very improvisational. That's the key word, improvisation. Improvisation in the Israeli self-perception is sometimes equated as a hallmark of excellence in national security affairs. What is improvisation? Improvisation is your ability to find unpre-planned solutions in the situation of uncertainty. Improvisation is also considered to be a perfect solution for the situation of uncertainty and instability. And basically, that's exactly the situation that Israel finds itself in every given moment. That's point number 1, self-perception of improvisers. Improvisation is impossible without the general atmosphere. And the general atmosphere in Israel, the zeitgeist of Israeli strategic community, if you wish, it's the feeling of trying the impossible, going against odds. Something very important, non-existent in many places around the world, very high tolerance to experimentation, very high tolerance to risk-taking, very high tolerance to failure, which produces, and this is point number 3, very interesting managerial culture within Israeli public, private, and of course national security sector. We are looking at a country or strategic community with very peculiar subordinate-superior relations. These are informal relations. There is a lack of distance, in fact, in Israeli subordinate-superior relations. There is a cult of simplicity. And together with their social informality, informal social relations, it's another multiplier of innovation. Israeli managerial culture encourages subordinates to challenge ideas of their superiors. If you're not doing that, you're considered to be someone who is lacking initiative, you are lacking backbone, you will not be promoted. Only if you are challenging your superiors, that's actually one of the pledges for your promotion. But you should challenge them actually with the creative solutions to the given problems. That brings me to point number 4. Most Israeli organizations, especially in the defense sector, from the beginning had very lean organizational structures and bureaucratic DNA. So coupled with this open atmosphere, which I mentioned in the previous point, enabled different services within the military and also different parts within the defense industry to come out with innovative bottom-up solutions. Israel traditionally is innovating not in the top-down manner, but in the bottom-up manner. These innovations, these bottom-up innovations, due to the lean organizational structures, enable to quick organizational learning, enable to transform ideas horizontally very quickly, and to exploit short lines of communication. And point number 5. I'll get back to it later when I talk about the downsides of the Israeli approach, but in general, Israelis often, even more often than needed, rely on technological solutions for operational strategic problems. That's basically already turned into some sort of strategic instinct or organizational instinct. You're immediately looking for technological solution for the given tactical operational challenge. That's very widespread historically across the military services of the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, Israeli military. Their eventual outcome of this approach is that in every given moment in Israel, historically, there were a lot of niche, narrow technological innovations. When, at some point, senior strategic management arrives to the conclusion that there is a changing, let's say, character of war or transformation of the way how military business is conducted in this moment of history, there is always available particular narrow technological solution on which the system can concentrate its organizational and financial energy, then take this narrow innovation and diffuse or disseminate it across the system. That's the story how Israeli precision-guided munitions and standoff weapons were introduced. That's exactly the story of Israeli UAVs, unmanned air vehicles, which right now Israel is well known for, and that's definitely the story of Israeli cyber innovation. Something that was produced in the very narrow, or as a very narrow solution to the very particular intelligence problem. But then, when their political leadership or defense management came to the conclusion that we are in the era when IT is actually their key shaper of strategic behavior in our side and on the other side, that immediately was replicated and turned into a systemic solution. These are 10 points. Let me just wrap up. Can Israeli experience be replicated to other countries? That's the most natural question that you may wish to ask. Even the countries that are operating under similar geopolitical conditions. In other words, countries that convince themselves that they are surrounded by enemies or that they are facing a huge, be it existential or serious, security threat. Well, possibly, but not necessarily. By the way, if you want to look for a country that is following Israeli experience for quite a lot of time and is trying to emulate Israeli ideas and to use this country as a case study for application of Israeli experience, this would be Singapore. Country thousands of kilometers apart from Israel, but Singapore actually is a country that, according to what is written in the books and in the newspapers, actively cooperating with Israel since the 50s and 60s in their security and defense domain. Actually, Singapore not only buying Israeli technology and concepts of operation, it is actually trying to replicate Israeli approach to innovation. If you go and read what Singaporeans are saying to themselves about their assessment of application of Israeli approach to innovation, they are rather frustrated. Why? Well, of course, Singapore is slightly different from Israel in a sense that Singapore is not experiencing, fortunately and unfortunately, quite frequent military conflicts with its neighbors. So there is no reality check for innovation. Singapore wasn't at war since the establishment of the state, as opposed to the state of Israel. However, the main reason why Singaporeans, who are also small, who also have a draft, who also inject significant financial and organizational energy into their approach to innovation, think that they are not successful in replicating Israeli experience is mainly cultural, organizational. Singapore is a country with very clear hierarchical both society and organizational structures. Challenging authority in this cultural organizational setting is inappropriate. Singapore is a country with their culture that has very low tolerance for experimentation, risk-taking, and especially failure. Also, it's a country that for cultural reasons would qualify improvisation as amateurishness, as lack of planning. And for that reason, for these cultural reasons, many of their approaches that are characteristic to Israel and that are often positioned as Israeli multipliers of innovation are unapplicable in the case of Singapore.
Excuse me, it would be good to to go to the final remarks, if you could.
Excellent. Let it be the final statement then.
Wonderful.
I am only an expert on Israel. I'm not an expert on the countries that are interested in the Israeli experience. So it's totally up to you to decide to what extent the countries that you know better and that you are coming from are compatible and actually relevant for Israeli experience. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And lastly, Vaidas, please.
Thank you. I thought I was going to give you some 20 slides, but no, I'll probably speak. It'll be fast. A couple of years ago, I was in Warsaw. It was a NATO summit, and a colleague journalist from Finland approached me, and we said hi. And so, what do you do? I'm a troll hunter. She said, I'm Jessica. I hunt trolls. Oh, it was exciting. What does that mean? And she explained to me how she was attacked by trolls, by Russia-related trolls, so to speak. And now here I am, 2 years after that. I do pretty much the same, except maybe I don't just hunt trolls, so to speak. I probably hunt for narratives. I hunt for fake news. I hunt for misleading, disinformation, propaganda, whatever you name it. Those are different things, sometimes similar, interlacking things. But in general, this is what I do. I write about that. But first of all, you have to ask yourself a question, why? Why do you do it, man? Are you some crazy fake news junkie or something? No. I just study history as well. And if you look at the history, it doesn't take a lot, brainwashed people, to later, be part of something nasty, to be a cause of something nasty in a country. Ruva mentioned that a lot of election meddling and disinformation talk started since 2014 with the Ukrainian events. Actually, yeah, I would say that, and it started much earlier than that. You can go as long as human history goes, when the first caveman drew a picture of his next cave neighbor wife having some, dealings with another caveman, and there was a tribe feud, and there was a warfare. Whenever there's warfare, there's fake news and misinformation and propaganda. We used it, enemies used it, everybody used that. It's just different tools and different means. But in 1920s, at least twice in this country, there were attempts to meddle in the elections here. In 91, there's been a great propaganda campaign after the TV tower attack, and it still continues until this day. You can call it one of the longer propaganda campaigns. So when you have thousands of witnesses, you have hundreds of victims, you have 14 dead and the relatives, and then you have a propaganda machine saying it never happened, there was a conspiracy, there were female snipers, whatever. You have all those narratives, and I hunt for those narratives. But then again, why are they so important? Why do you do that, right? Ukrainian example again. What damage could a long-term brainwashing via TV, other information channels can do to a country where you have people who actually have joined separatists, so to speak. You have foreign involvement from Russia, obviously, but then you have a mass of people who are ambiguous, who have no idea what's going on. They don't know what to do, because this is one of the key weapons of a disinformation campaign. You spread dissent, you spread fear, confusion, you disarm your enemy. And then I understand that earlier today there was a fundamental question raised. Are we at war, so to speak? Is information campaign part of warfare? Well, you can say yes, you can say no, you can discuss it until you are under the table. It doesn't matter, because information warfare is already happening, it has been happening, and it will happen again. So what do you do about that? Well, we started, a couple of years ago, we started a project in Delphi, because, again, if you are in some small institution and bigger in state institution, a think tank, it's a very good word, and I hated it before, and I really love it now. The word is called awareness. I mean, what is awareness? Have you ever thought about that? It sounds very nice. I mean, you get some grants, some funding, right? You spend it on some project. You write a paper maybe. You have a cocktail party. Yeah, we've done it. So what? I mean, a couple hundred people read it, maybe thousands, right? How about hundreds of thousands? What about millions? Can you reach that? Because this is what the fake news, this is what disinformation campaign really targets, the masses. You can deny it, you can dissect it, but you react, and you react afterwards when the dinner is done already. I promised Lucas to talk about food in the information war aspect. So if you want to make a Vienna schnitzel, you have to batter down that veal. You are all the veal that is being battered now. We are bombarded by information warfare messages everywhere. And so we started a project called Damaskok in Delphi, because Delphi is one of the major online media websites in Lithuania, and we have the reach. So what? Okay, you write about the fake news story, you dissect it, you react. In the beginning, it took us days sometimes to find the original source, because sometimes it's very easy. You have a no-name blog spreading a pure, as I call it, pure fake news story. Something happened, which really never happened. You spread it on social networks, you spread it on some websites, and then you have people clicking it and sharing it on Facebook. We are a Facebook nation, not a Twitter nation. And you see even smart people, intellectual people, who are sharing it. And then we remember, yeah, 1940, you had a bunch of intellectual people going to Moscow to bring the son of Stalin. So it may, repeat it again if you brainwash enough critical mass of that kind of people. And yeah, it takes time to debunk a story. And then we had help. A tool was created. It was actually launched today. Well, not the tool was launched today, but the website is called damaskok.lt. It's not just us any longer. It's not just Delphi. It's other media outlets as well. That involves three key factors. One of them is media, obviously. Another is the artificial intelligence, which allows, a tool itself allows us to see the fake news stories in the list out of 10,000 articles, which may be fake, maybe not, you have to check. It allows us to prioritize, to get the ones which are most harmful, which may cause dissent, which may confuse us all, to the top. Then we have a community. They call themselves elves, and anyone can be an elf. It's not the pointy-ear Tolkien creature. It's any person maybe here. It can be a student, a teacher, a pensioner, a IT specialist, a gardener. Whoever has certain set of skills, and he or she can show those skills, can prove it, can vote whether this fake news story is truly fake, maybe it is propaganda, maybe it is true. You have tens of thousands of stories on websites that often spreads disinformation, sometimes just pure propaganda, which is a mix of facts and mix of interpretations, so to speak, on certain narratives. And that person can help us, media, to catch that story faster than it spreads. That is, it is set to be published on 12 p.m. And in 1 hour, we can already see it, we can dissect it together, we can already debunk it, and we can write about it before it reaches the audience. This is actually the pretty much the target. We can do the work faster than a couple of years ago. Now you can imagine what will happen when, like I said, more media will join us in this endeavor. We can work even faster, but it's not the people who does most of the job. It's the system, the machine, as we call it, the artificial intelligence. And until it becomes Skynet or 01 and destroys all, I think we will have a good time dissecting those fake news stories. And, well, this is why and what we do it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, please.
So I just want to point out that I was talking about foreign actor meddling into Western elections. So disinformation, of course, is much more older. My favorite example is Aristophanes' play named Clouds. They described how Socrates is an awful person. He got so drunk that he falls off out of his own bed, and we all know how this ended.
Yeah, wonderful. As a moderator, I'm very happy to see this diverse panel with different professional experience. And before I give out the questions to the audience, I would like to go through a round of short questions. So please try to aim to answer in a minute or so. What do you see as three main emerging, currently emerging or soon to be emerging threats in the virtual domain from your professional points of view?
Is this on? Yes, it is. I've not thought about this yet, Lucas. One thing is, at the moment, everybody has this idea that it's not that hard to go and hack an election by putting out crap on social media, which I suspect means a lot of people will be investing in developing a capability to put out crap on social media. So I would imagine that in the next few years, there'll just be more and more content to kind of work our way through. I'll leave it at that. If I think of something else, I'll jump in at the end.
Probably the one that we've seen is already a combination of fake and cyber. That is, it's based on simple scam stories, what you get from Nigerian princes offering you millions. You get fake news stories which have very saucy headlines or saucy material, and there's just one nice attachment to it, an email, that can infect a computer of a hapless a government official, a low-level official in MOD, for example. We've seen it already, and this, at the moment, I do believe that what we are seeing is just a testing phase. We're being probed, not attacked yet.
So I would answer this question more generally. I think that the biggest threat is that the trust itself is fading. Trust towards politicians, trust towards governments, and trust towards media. And if we don't, actually it was quite nice report came out recently, Trust Index, I guess it was called. And it showed that media actually reached the bottom now. It never has been so untrusted. And this is a problem. So if our people don't trust politicians, if we don't trust media, this means that in case of emergency, how can they reach them? So this is probably, or possibly, the most probable threat. Another one, I would say, is that divide between politicians and tech people, big tech companies. Big tech companies sometimes don't understand how, policy making is working, or why, or this or another kind of policies are needed in societies. And at the same time, politicians don't have a clue what are the algorithms, for example. So this is another quite big threat, I think.
Yes. We Israelis were very technocentric in our problem framing and often in problem solving. And it's the downside of the Israeli approach to innovation. So you mentioned the case of the Russian intervention in the US elections. The lessons that we learned from this case in Israel, it's actually about the downside and the danger of being over-fixated on technology. That's what's happening to us. You talked about cyber. If you look at cyber topology, in the world, there are countries when they say cyber, or strategic communities when they say cyber, they mean digital technological effects. There are other communities, when you say cyber, they mainly think about cognitive psychological issues. It's the continuum. We in Israel, as the United States, as many countries in NATO, are closer to the digital technological part of it. Our adversaries, for example, Hamas and Hezbollah, they're closer to cognitive psychological part of it. When we are in the situation of strategic interaction, with such a different conceptualization of this capability, we are often outperformed by the other side. It takes us time, it took us time actually in the recent conflicts in Gaza to outsource and to learn how to develop this soft capability. In the case of the United States, the country that actually was talking about their cyber Pearl Harbor, the intelligence blunder or intelligence failure in the cyber affairs compatible to Pearl Harbor. We have right now memoirs of the former head of the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, who just left after the Trump administration arrived. We have the memoirs of the head of the CIA and head of FBI. All of them are referring in these books that came out during this year to the story of Russian intervention in the US elections. All of them are saying that we were over-fixated in cyber Pearl Harbor on the digital technological part of the story, and that's how we missed that thing. So, big data, artificial intelligence can provide us with knowledge, but not with understanding. So in this particular case, like in 1941 with Barbarossa, like in 1941 with Pearl Harbor, like in 9/11, it wasn't the lack of information that big data provides us with in the US intelligence community, but the poverty of comprehension. The lesson for us and the big challenge for us, it's not technological, it's analytical mainly.
Very interesting. Rolf, you talked about Facebook and Twitter. Do you think the situation will maintain, or do you think this whole fight will move on to other platforms anytime soon?
I think at the moment it's pretty much on all platforms. Is it not loud enough?
Yeah, it's loud.
Every platform I've looked at, I find really basic automation going on all the time. One of the things we're hoping to do with the robo-trolling series is to do an edition on From.iki, Kontaktie. The early analysis I've done of that shows it's full of bots and really primitive sort of automation. And I suspect that's similar for Instagram, where there's a culture of essentially buying audiences. And I don't know enough about Snapchat to be able to comment. What have I missed?
YouTube.
YouTube, yeah, full of it, absolutely.
Very interesting. Urve, you mentioned cooperation. What is the current state of cooperation in the Baltic states, in Europe, in the West, or in the NATO in regards to cyber threats currently?
In the very wide meaning of cyber, considering all those attack vectors I mentioned, one of my favorite and maybe the best example is happening in Estonia, when actually government and media managed to work together to prevent a rather serious disinformation attack. And it happened a few months ago. Then one of the conscripts at Defense Forces shot himself into a shoulder to get a cool scar. That's what he said, and military police investigated it and found that this is exactly what the case was. He just wanted to look cool in the eyes of his friends, and he decided to shoot himself into a shoulder. Well, it didn't end too well. There was a lot of blood. He survived, but a few days later, Estonian Sputnik sent his questions to Defense Forces. And the questions were following. Is that true that the conscript was Russian speaker? Is that true that he was a Russian nationality? Is that true that he shot himself because the tensions between Estonians and Russians in military camp are so high that it was impossible for him to be there? Is it true that he was shot during the escape attempt? And is it true that he was denied of medical care after he was shot, just because he's a Russian speaker? So what would you do if you have that kind of questions? So the ministry understood very well that whatever they answer to Sputnik, it will be turned into disinformation piece. So instead, they gave out the questions to media, media outlets, Estonian Public Broadcasting and other media outlets. And they all published a story about how Sputnik tried to write a piece asking that kind of questions. So, of course, Sputnik got very angry, and he published another piece, very angry piece, accusing both Estonian Ministry of Defense and Estonian outlets on spreading disinformation. But you know, the thing is that this story didn't get any impact. And the reason why is that the public was already prepared. They already know what is going to happen. So I think this is a very good example of how those different groups in society can work together. Because you know, usually is that, like, people think that media, especially privately owned media and governments, are on a different sides. It's like, you know, always journalists want to know some dirty secrets about politicians and other government members. But this time they managed to work together, and that was beautiful.
Very interesting. Dmitry, in the West, countries tend to get stuck on the descriptive sort of approach to information warfare. Do you have any concrete examples that could be exported from the experience in Israel that could be easily adapted here in the West, in the Baltic region, and in NATO as a whole?
Thank you. I can actually only re-emphasize what I said in the previous point, because I think it's pretty much applicable to all of you. Also in the first panel, we made a reference to hybrid threats. Actually, the intellectual history of the term hybridity is coming from their Israeli-American joint effort in their early 2000 or in the mid-2000 to conceptualize threats in the Middle East. In terms of the definition of the threats, they're very similar to the way how hybridity is perceived today in NATO. It's a combination of military and non-military tools of influence across the domains, merging public and private also. But when we say hybridity in Israel, we mean a military organization that is equipped, military organization of the non-state actor that is equipped along the lines of the state actor and is acting along the logic of terrorism or guerrilla tactic. So when we are dealing with this type of organizations, the weakest part of us, or our weakest part and our actually deficiency, is the ability to address the soft aspect of functioning of this organization. They are usually merging kinetic and non-kinetic forms of activity much better than we do. And since we are fixated usually on technological solutions, it takes us a lot of time and a lot of psychological transformation to move from their technological area of interaction into their non-technological one. In many cases, we found it very useful, well, at least Israeli experience teaches that it was very useful to outsource particular capabilities to civilian agencies or to civilian entities that possess much better expertise, even private, in this area than those that are in-house within the system.
Vaidas, you're working with disinformation every day. Is there a way that you could classify the disinformation that is reaching Lithuania? What is the most prominent source or method that they're using? Is it disinformation, misinformation, fake news? How are they trying to approach our societies?
Well, I guess the fake news, or the pure fake news, is a very small percentage. That's maybe 10, maybe 5%, maybe less, because the fake news stories, when they appear, they create a lot of attention, and they are very quickly debunked because it's very easy now to check, what happened. There was an accident on the road. U.S. vehicles had an accident, and suddenly there's a message that a child was killed, and then you can invent those stories. A girl was raped, another child was crucified, and you repeat those same stories everywhere. In Germany, in Lithuania, in Poland, in Estonia, you can see the patterns, but they are easy to debunk and very fast. Now, with this old-fashioned propaganda where you mix facts with falsehoods, with interpretations that fit your narrative, that you try to repeat them again and again and again to spread your message and your narratives, It's much harder, and they make up most of what is being attempted to do. And it's often, and you can see, especially on the social media, social networks, it is the most effective because you see people sharing stories by the thousands, actually. How, you know, this glass of water is cost 1 cent in the Western Europe. You would pay 10 euros, and it's because of EU, or it's because of LGBT, or it's because of NATO. And you repeat those stories again and again and again, and then you can actually see people them repeating here as well. Maybe you are intellectual, maybe you are smart, but then you see, you know, people who seem to be smart being fooled. You know, they get into a trap by themselves.
Okay, let's open the questions. Please keep them short. Please say who are you addressing the question to, and please try focusing on the question rather than making a remark. Please, Ambassador. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Itlas for Hybrid Threat Foreign Minister of Lithuania. I probably would address to our Lithuanian colleague, Valdas Aldžiūnas. This is genuine Lithuanian media efforts to debunk fake news, and which we very much appreciate. Demas Kuok, Valdas probably didn't make this translation. This is unmask or denounce, expose.
Debunk.
Debunk, yes, debunk. But it also reminds me that there are several other initiatives. EU Stratcom, Center of Excellence in Riga, also doing similar. Do you see possibilities somehow to connect all this private media, governmental or NATO EU initiative in one sort of? Lucas represents another important initiative, DFCD, Atlantic Council Lab, yes. So do you see the possibility to connect all these dots in sort of like a community of sharing knowledge and sharing sort of understanding? Because that probably would be us in the government, our dream, to see these sort of genuine efforts from government organizations and from media, grassroots. Thank you.
So, not to make too much time, the answer, do I see? Yes. It's just a matter of, you know, we sit down, we see the technical details about it, we see where our strengths and weaknesses are, where we can, you know, have added value from one or another, and where we can imagine how. It's just a matter of technical. We know about each other, especially in Lithuania. It's not a big country. So, again, it's a matter of initiative, who shows what.
All right. Question here, Major.
Thank you very much. I'm Ruta Lisauskaitė from Institute of International Relations and Political Science. I'm a student, and my question will be for Mr. Rolf and Mr. Vaidas. You talked about the information and how to debunk the fake news, fake events, and sort of things. But what problem I see is the echo chamber and filter bubble that actually is on internet. And well, in my feed, my news feed, I usually see the debunking, not the actual fake news. So probably the people, the part of society that actually see the fake news, don't see the debunking. Do you see such problem, and how to solve it? Thank you.
Okay, we could probably start first again. Well, I work in a media that has a reach of half of the population every month. So that's a good number. We do not cover yet TV, so to speak. You may live in a bubble, you may live in an information bubble. For example, research was made a couple of years ago about the minorities being susceptible to fake news and propaganda. And those who watch only a single source of information, they are mostly susceptible to those issues. To get them and attract them more to more diverse sources, that's an issue, of course. And we will be working, on at least on my part, we will be working to have more reach, not just online, I mean, not just on Facebook, not just on Delphi, not just on other websites. We will try to get to more or the audiences, but we will not get them all, obviously. There will always be those who believe in conspiracy theories, those who spread that via their personal reasons, stupidity, money, or other reasons. There will always be those. The idea is to make the critical mass of those who can recognize what is what and can quickly squash that information bubble that we've seen in, for example, in Ukraine, the vastness of that misinformation, that nothing was being done about that, only in certain bubbles. I don't believe we now live in a bubble. I think we talk about that quite a lot, and we will be talking more.
Thank you. I don't think I spoke directly about debunking, but there is a lot of work that's looked at the efficacy of debunking, and I think the sort of scientific consensus is that debunking can work if you're trying to contradict something where the people seeing it don't already have a very firm opinion. So if I feel like something might be true and then I'm quickly told, yeah, it's definitely not true, that's going to be an effective debunk. But if I really firmly believe something and somebody's telling me the opposite, and by the way, NATO is paying for this message, then that's really just going to enforce me in my pre-existing belief. I know the social media companies are doing quite a bit to try to tackle echo chamber problems, but we don't really know the details of exactly what they're doing. There are things like playing with the algorithm to show people messages that are somehow slightly out of sync with what they normally see, so to make the echo chamber a little bit weaker. Time will tell if that's effective or not.
Yes, please. Good afternoon. Thank you, panelists. My name is Remy Žilinskas. I'm a military scientist at Lithuania Military Academy, just a few blocks away. So my question goes to Professor Dmitry Adamski. So how do you think national service, or draft as you call it, contributes to the three pillars, human, conceptual, and of course technological, of Israel statehood, or as I call it, my national resilience? It's not only society. So thank you very much. And it can be, okay, that's it, thank you.
Thank you, Major, for your question. I'll be happy to elaborate on the margins later on off topic, but I think the key word in my response would be something that I mentioned in my talk. It's an ecosystem. Israeli youngster who is right now going to their last grade, let's say to the 12th grade or 11th grade, if he thinks strategically about his life in the future, he will probably go and take as much mathematics, or not everyone, but a lot of people will take as much mathematics and physics as possible, because they know that upon the draft, I mean in 2 years, they will be drafted to the military, and there is a general consensus among a lot of young people that they want to go to the most elite unit of the military, which is 8200, which is the cyber unit within Israeli National Signal Agency, their main signal intelligence organization of the IDF. Why they want together? They want together because they know that during 3 years of service, maybe 4 years of service, just doing compulsory service, they will be trained and acquire hands-on experience that upon their demobilization on the job market will serve them enormously. In fact, many of them will go either to the universities or they will just immediately join the labor market. Most of the Israeli startups, as you know, are building on these youngsters from 8200. That's not the only unit. That's the only unit that is known to the general public, but there are much more. Then these people go to the industry, and then even in the private industry, they are then going back to serve in the reserves. And they're bringing some of their private life, professional life knowledge back into the system. Then, going back from the reserves into the market, they again bringing some professional instinct back and forth. It's an ecosystem. It wouldn't be possible without a very clear, thorough, and systematic regulation of the government. We just established in Israel a couple of years ago National Cyber Authority. When they are thinking about turning Israel into their cyber power, they are thinking about the military, of course, but as in my story, it's also about high school education, it's also about the universities, it's also about their labor, and it's also about training people in different disciplines and professions. So it's an ecosystem. So there is a need in holistic systemic look at this issue when it comes to the draft. Thank you.
Yeah. Question here.
Hi, my name is Tyler Smith. I'm a software engineer and cybersecurity researcher from the US. And I'm curious, in this kind of technology-focused panel, what would you each describe as the gaps in technology that you use to combat disinformation? So what technology is missing that would help you in your work?
The technology is fine, it's just really data access is really missing, right? Like it's very hard to get hold of the data we need to be able to study these questions properly because they're all locked away in servers, usually in America somewhere.
Okay, thank you for a question. In a way, it will be a response to you and also observation to Vaidas, to your point about big data and artificial intelligence. In Israel right now, within intelligence community, among theoreticians there is an intelligence community in Israel, practitioners, they engage with each other in theoretical debates about the technologies needed to outperform the other side. Basically, exactly your question. And there are two schools of thought, by the way, in your country as well. I think Israelis are pretty much similar to Americans in this regard. These two schools of thought of intelligence analysts are asking questions to what extent we, in the era of big data and artificial intelligence, should do intelligence business on the strategic level different from the way we did it before. So these two schools of thought are very straightforward. One, I think, is best illustrated by the recent book by my colleague from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Yuval Noah Harari, Lessons for the 21st Century. By the way, I was fascinated yesterday in Vilniaus bookstore to see this book translated into Lithuanian. So it's a book that just came out, and there is a chapter in it called Artificial Intelligence. The bottom line argument of Yuval in this chapter is that basically, if we look further on artificial intelligence, algorithm will be able to outline patterns about our future behavior that will understand us better than we understand ourselves. So basically, the point for intelligence people, the takeaway for intelligence people is that if you are taking artificial intelligence, it will enable you to outline patterns of strategic behavior of the other side better than any other intelligence analyst would do before. Pretty much the point that Vaidas made when he talked about the big data, patterns recognition. It's one school of thought. The problem with the school of thought is that, first of all, artificial intelligence is still not there. Right now, it's just science fiction. I mean, people themselves who are doing it, yourself included, probably agree with that. The second problem is that it's a problem to rely on the past in order to prognose future strategic behavior. Sometimes even people who we know very well, our relatives, are surprising us with very counterintuitive behavior. Then there is a second school of thought that also talks about big data and technology, and here the best illustration is probably a book by Peter Thiel, From Zero to One. You know, Peter Thiel, the famous entrepreneur who produced PayPal, who is considered to be guru of a lot of startup people. He is very straightforward in his book, From Zero to One. He's saying that big data, it's a dumb data. If you want to produce actionable insights from big data, you need to have a human analyst that is capable to situate this big data or insights from big data in the very concrete context. Because if you want to understand complex strategic behavior of the competitor who is learning all the time and interacting with you, you can't count on the machine. That's the second school of thought. In Israel right now, I think the second school of thought, like in the United States, is basically suppressing the first school of thought. So artificial intelligence and big data today are useful for the sake of hypothesis generation and testing. In other words, you can make intelligence assumptions about strategic behavior of the other side, and then you can refute or basically discuss different hypotheses by running them through big data or artificial intelligence. As of now, there is no artificial intelligence or big data that is capable to provide you with the concrete answers to this question. That's, by the way, exactly the story of Russian intervention into American elections. Exactly for this reason, big data and artificial intelligence were useless when it comes to strategic thinking of the other side. It's very useful, as Vaida said, on the tactical operational level, if you understand operational plot of the other side. But you are unable to use these tools to understand the way of strategic thinking or strategic creativity of the other side. So if I need something from you as an engineer, I would like you, I think it's impossible, but to provide with the machine that can diagnose strategic ingenuity or strategic intuition of the other side. I think that right now it's impossible.
All right, we're running very short of time, but who has the shortest question in the crowd? Two questions, two shortest questions. Here in the back and here in the middle.
Hi, Adam Mazel, Royal United Service Institute in London. My question is really for you, Irva. You talked about the cyber NATO or cyber alliance. So my question is, what would you envision that looking like structurally, what its mandate would be, why existing institutions fall short of, I guess, being able to surmount those challenges, and how implementing that wouldn't result in a cyber League of Nations?
Thank you for that. I don't think that there's something wrong with other institutions, but we already have, or other organizations. The only issue is that they are geographically defined. So basically, they are democratic countries that need to be protected outside of NATO and outside of EU. So that kind of new organization can very well made based on those two already existing organizations. It will only could include also those other countries outside of those organizations.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving the microphone. My name is Rugilė Trumpytė. I'm from Transparency International Lithuania, and I have a question also to Ms. Eslas. You mentioned that it's very, very important to make vulnerable groups less vulnerable, and we're discussing about this a lot. And there are different initiatives, quite many in fact. But the question is, are they effective? And I wondered, for inspiration, maybe you have any story to share or an example about such efforts or initiatives that were measured, tested, and it really worked well. Thank you.
Thank you for this. This is really good one. Well, I think I have one pretty good example. It's about Narva, which is an Estonian town, Eastern Estonian town next to Russian border. And it has been quite a challenge to us to integrate those people who live there more to Estonian society. Most of them are Russian speakers. And especially after what happened in Ukraine in 2014, probably because of Russian propaganda as well, but they kind of started to think that we need them only because we are afraid that that will be repeated in Estonia, what happened in Ukraine. So how to overcome this? How to explain this, how to get to these people, how to explain them, but we are one nation. It's not that we need you, we just want to, be more communicative to each other. So it was a really good question. But I think we managed to find a way. And this is partly to do with this communication model I mentioned earlier. So this communication model is Roman Jakobson's communication model, or part of it. And Roman Jakobson had very interesting detail in this communication model. And it was photic communication. So basically, it means that you don't deliver any message. Only thing you do, you are in contact. And this contact, being in contact in any possible way, is something that actually might help to overcome this vulnerability. For example, we are organizing, in this year, we are organizing, partly accidentally, they all happened to be in 1 year, there was a really good theatrical plays in Narva. And because of them, all Estonians living in other parts of Estonia want to go to Narva because there's such a good place there. There are several rock concerts there. Again, people want to go there, and people in Narva feel that, you know, they want to come to us. So this kind of overcomes this piece of information that Kremlin has tried to make them understand that they don't actually want you, they just, you know, make the face that they tolerate you just because they're afraid. This is nonsense. So just via this Fari Communication Act, I think that kind of bridges can be built.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we could sit here and talk until the very late night, but unfortunately we are running out of time, and I think it would be the best to move our discussions next to a refreshing cup of coffee. So I hope you all enjoyed this panel as much as I did, and please give a round of applause to the panelists.
111. So good afternoon. Finally, we all have arrived to yet another focal point of Vilnius consultations, a keynote by Dr. Antono Shekhovtsov, one of the leading experts on Russian domestic and foreign politics, and also he's specializing in rising fascism, a topic which is still ignored in political circles. I do hope that most of you have read, or at least heard, about Tango Noir, the book overviewing and thoroughly analyzing Kremlin's relationship with the West, and especially far-right movements of the West. And correct me if I am wrong, but I believe that Dr. Shekhovtsov was the first who coined the term marriage of convenience when describing relations between Russia and the West. So, Dr. Shekhovtsov, we are all more than curious to learn who is who in that marriage, and is it really convenient? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to talk to you today. And I want to start that with a very recent observation. While we are all gathered here, right now in Vilnius, while I'm talking, dozens, if not hundreds, of delegates from the US, from Europe, from some Asian countries, they're flocking to Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, because this city is hosting the so-called World Congress of Families, starting from tomorrow. And the World Congress of Families, this is an organization, international organization, which promotes so-called pro-family values, traditional values, family values, but at the same time attacks a lot the LGBT communities. And while it has headquarters in the US, still this organization is mostly active in Central and Eastern Europe. And why is it so? It is a question that I want to answer a bit later. But let me tell you that in 2014, the World Congress of Families, although under a different name, was held in Moscow. In 2016, they had the meeting in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and last year, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, hosted the event in Budapest. Russia plays a significant role in the workings of the World Congress of Families. Its representative in the United Nations, Alexei Komov, in Russia is connected to the Russian Orthodox Church and also to various structures of Russian ultranationalist businessman Konstantin Malofeev, who financially supported the initial separatist activities in eastern Ukraine before the regular army, Russian army invaded. And again, why Russia is so interested in promoting anti-LGBT hatred? In countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic states, Moldova, pro-Kremlin narratives may not be that popular, well, probably with the exception of Moldova, but what they can promote is they can promote anti-Western ideas. And LGBT in the discourse of Russian propaganda is essentially equated with liberal democracy and the West as such. The hatred towards LGBT people, LGBT communities, thus has a geopolitical dimension. If you look at groups that are sort of defending the so-called family values. In Ukraine, there is an organization called Tradition and Order. In Georgia, there's an organization called Georgia in March. In Estonia, for example, there's an organization called For the Defense of Family and Tradition. If you look at those organizations, they may be they may be anti-Kremlin, they may be even anti-Russian, but at the same time, the other parts of their ideology would be completely fitting into Russian propaganda narrative about the decline of the West, about the failings of multiculturalism, about the so-called gay Europa, which is a combination of gayness and Europe. But this is a very recent development, and we actually could see almost similar narratives, not necessarily related to LGBT problematics, already in the beginning of the 20th century. Some would say that the relations between Russia and the far right, it's a very recent phenomenon. No, it's not. Even if we forget for just 1 second the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, essentially the Soviet Nazi pact that divided Europe into two spheres of influence, we can go as back as to the 1920s and see that the Soviets were actually quite ready to cooperate with the fascists in Germany. And that was the period when Germany still suffered the loss of the First World War, and some particular German fascists, they were quite ready to cooperate with the Soviets. There was a movement called National Bolshevism that considered the Soviet Union as a brotherly proletarian nation, and they thought that the West was trying to conquer both Germany and the Soviet Union. And for Germany at that time, they did not consider themselves part of the West. They considered themselves Mitteleuropa, the middle Europe, or Central Europe. And some Soviet officials, for example, Karel Radek, the secretary of Comintern, he was quite sympathetic towards particular strands in German fascism. And I will give you a quote, which I find quite illuminating. In the 1920s, there were still some fights between far-right Freikorps members from the German side and Belgians and French. And one Freikorps member, Albert Schlageter, was killed. And Karel Radek used this death of this German ultranationalist, essentially fascist, to build bridges with the German fascists. And he wrote, "Against whom do the German people wish to fight? Against the Entente capital or against the Russian people? With whom do they wish to ally themselves? With the Russian workers and peasants in order to throw off the yoke of the Entente capital together, or with the Entente capital for the enslavement of the German and Russian nations?" And there was a narrative which was quite popular. Of course, with the rise of the NSDAP, the Nazi parties, all those national Bolsheviks who were sympathizing with the Soviet Union, they were completely destroyed. But they re-emerged very quickly after the Second World War. Germany was divided into two parts: West Germany, East Germany, and the Soviet. And there were a lot of discussions in the 1950s whether West Germany should join NATO. And the Soviet Union was, of course, against this development, and it funded, financially, they gave a lot of money through their agents in Eastern Europe to the German neo-fascists, to the West German neo-fascists, because they were also against West Germany joining NATO for one particular reason, because that would fix the division of Germany into two. And that for the German nationalists was a huge trauma. That was, they feared that Germany would never be united. So they were against their country joining NATO. And for that reason, the Soviets sponsored, essentially, those far-right circles. And within the far-right circles, there was this organization called Bruderschaft, or Brotherhood. They managed to combine a racist language, or a neo-Nazi language, with this sort of Soviet ideas about progress and improvement. And I will give you a quote which I find illuminating. Alfred Franke-Griksch, one of the leaders of that organization, Brotherhood or Bruderschaft, he argued, "The torch of racial and cultural rebirth has fallen from the innovated hands of once proud peoples and has been retrieved by the senior young Slavs and Germans who have become the real founders of a revolutionary order. The Prussian eagle and the Russian bear are the symbols of a new synthesis in which German idealism and Slavic materialism will be raised to a new dialectical level." West Germany joined NATO in 1955, so the Soviets essentially stopped funding for those organizations, but they still would use West German fascists to sort of undermine West Germany. There was an operation led by the KGB in the late 1950s where Soviet agents or East German agents, with the help of the Soviets, they painted swastikas on synagogues in West Germany, on Jewish cemeteries, on Jewish shops, in order to prove that, well, you see, West Germany joined NATO, and there is again the rise of Nazism in West Germany. That actually that was quite a huge blow for West Germany. For example, some of the British businessmen declined to do business with West Germany. So that operation was, I would say, quite successful. But it was, however, not until the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 when this cooperation between various Russian actors and far-right nationalists in the West became open and even public. But at that time, it was mostly Russian ultranationalists, such as Vladimir Zhirinovsky, such as Alexander Dugin, or Sergei Glaziev, Sergei Baburin, who tried to establish those contacts with their counterparts in the West. That was not the regime, that was not Yeltsin's administration who was interested in those cooperation, but Russian ultranationalists. They saw, first they did this for their own benefit, because they thought that international cooperation can bring them legitimacy and popularity inside Russia. They were not thinking of taking those ideas, the far-right ideas, to the power. They were all in the opposition to Yeltsin's regime. And particular far-right organizations, they were quite happy to cooperate with the Russians, because especially in 1992, 1993, and if you remember, that was the period, the 1993 was the attack on the White House, on the governmental building in Russia. That was because Yeltsin decided to essentially destroy the communist and ultranationalist opposition in Russia. But before that, there was a huge hope on the part of the Western far-right, or European far-right, that maybe Russia will become sort of a country with an ideology similar to what they would have. But that was, of course, a groundless hope. And it all ended quite quickly. But something happened, because now we see that in 2014, I will talk about this in more detail a bit later. In 2014, the French far-right party Front National, the National Front, received a 9 million loan from the Russian bank. So what happened in this period? And I would distinguish several periods where you could trace how the Kremlin itself gradually became interested in cooperating with far-right groups in the West. And one period, the initial period, started in 2004-2005. That was the period when a series of color revolutions took place in the post-Soviet space. First in Georgia in 2003, then Ukraine in 2004, and then Kyrgyzstan in 2005. For the Kremlin, it was interpreted, all those color revolutions, they were interpreted as a Western or US-led attempt to destroy the Russian sphere of influence. And there were a lot of anti-Americanism, which was quite marginal in the 90s. It suddenly became quite mainstream in Russia. But there was another development which was very important in the context of the topic that I'm talking about. And that was the elections themselves. Because all those color revolutions, they were not real revolutions. They were just quite successful protests against the electoral fraud, against stolen elections. And people close to the Kremlin, experts, the expert community close to the Kremlin, they realized that those protests were essentially mobilized in a way by the independent NGOs that provided electoral monitoring of the elections. For example, the OSCE mission at that time would say that those elections in Georgia or Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, they were not completely fair, they were not completely open, and that mobilized people to go out to the streets and protest against those electoral fraud. And particular groups of people in Russia, they realized, so if those electoral monitoring missions can mobilize people, well, let's have our own electoral monitoring missions. And they would go to problematic spaces, problematic countries, and they would confirm and they would acknowledge the victory of, say, pro-Russian candidates. Or with a different development, for example, if the pro-Russian candidates would lose, those electoral monitoring missions would say that those elections were unfair. So let us have our own pocket electoral observation missions. And from 2005, 2006, those organizations started working, and those Russian organizations and their partners in the European Union, they needed basically those electoral observers who would play this game, who would do this particular job. And they found those friends in the far-right circles in Russia, in the European Union. And those people, far-right politicians, they would go to Ukraine, for example, or Russia, and they would rubber stamp the fraudulent elections. And I will give you a quote which I find particularly funny. Nick Griffin, the former leader of the fascist British party called British National Party, in 2011 he went to observe the parliamentary elections in Russia. And if you remember, 2011 parliamentary elections, those were the elections that sparked the protests. The largest protest in Putin Russia was sparked by those elections, which were completely fraudulent. But Nick Griffin, the British fascist, he goes there, he observes those elections, he comes back to the UK, and he writes on the website of the British National Party, "In Russia, I was stunned to discover instead a robust, transparent, and properly democratic system that made me even more aware than ever of the truly shocking failings of the archaic and corrupted shambles that masquerade as free and fair elections in Great Britain." And you would have these people going to Russia, going to some other countries in the post-Soviet space, and again, rubber stamping those elections. And that was the first period. And this continues up until now. If you remember this entire scandal around the so-called referendum in Crimea in 2014, and people who were present there as electoral observers, they are coming from that particular circle that was formed already in 2005, 2006. And they are going now, they are globalizing completely. If they started with Russia, if they started with these so-called post-Soviet space, now they go to Cambodia, they go to Zimbabwe. So it's not even confined now to this post-Soviet space. It goes even further. But there was another period that is very important. Another sort of activization or mobilization of the cooperation with the far right. And that started in 2008. And this is related to the Russo-Georgian War in August 2008. It was a very short war, 5 days, Georgia lost. But again, Russian expert communities close to the Kremlin, or pro-Kremlin expert communities, they all said that, okay, so we won the war very easily, 5 days, perfect, but we lost the information war. We failed to convince the West that Russia's actions in Georgia were justified, that the occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia was justified. And they understood that maybe the failure was about the international Russian media, Russian international media. They had Russia Today already then. Russia Today was formed in 2005, and it was essentially a tool of, a soft power instrument of the Russian Federation. It was about how beautiful Russia is, how great Russia is. It was not the TV channel that we know now. So they thought, okay, so this is not working. If we promote this narrative, Russia is good, Russia is great, this is not working. We have to do something else. They also had the Voice of Russia, this radio station with the website in several European languages. Again, it was just political news with no propaganda, essentially. So they thought, well, okay, so we have to do something about this. In 2009, they renamed Russia Today into RT. And not in order to conceal the Russian source of this TV channel, but in order to show that RT was no longer about Russia, that was essentially about the West. So the narrative has changed. Formerly, originally it was Russia is good, but the narrative of RT became the West is bad, this is why they don't understand why Russia is good. And again, they needed commentators, and those commentators should be coming from the West, should be coming from Europe. Because in order to give legitimacy for the Russian propaganda in the West, they needed Western people who would support those propagandistic narratives. And already in August 2008, they realized that they could find those commentators among the far-right politicians or activists in the West itself. In August 2008, right after the war with Georgia, Russia Today invited to one of its programs, an American fascist, Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche is a fascist and a conspiracy theorist, and who's quite obsessed with the British oligarchs. He would talk about the British oligarchs all the time, but of course for him it's a euphemism for the Jews. And Russia Today was quite happy to transmit his views on the Russian-Georgian war, and he would say, of course, those were the British oligarchs who made the Georgians start the war, and those British oligarchs were supported by the US. So they realized, okay, so we have this pool of commentators, far-right commentators, who would just confirm and justify all our actions, and they started engaging with those far-right commentators. And they would have, for example, Richard Spencer, an infamous American neo-Nazi who was partly responsible for the massacre in Charlottesville last year. So Richard Spencer, this hardly educated neo-Nazi, he would pose as the expert on Syria and Libya on Russia Today. Of course, many people would not know who Richard Spencer is, so they would swallow this lie very easily. But for those people who knew what sort of people were invited to Russia Today, or RT since 2009, it was very clear that it was just disinformation and propaganda in the worst sense of this word. So that was the beginning of the second phase. And again, this continues. You would also see far-right commentators, far-right politicians, activists, who may be not known in their own countries, but they would be invited by RT, they would be invited by Sputnik News, which replaced the Voice of Russia in 2014, and they would pose as experts and as analysts. There was an important third period when cooperation between Russian actors and the far right even increased, and that was 2011, 2013. And again, there were factors that mobilized that cooperation, or activated that cooperation. And that was, there was three main events. First, the Arab Spring from 2010, 2011, which was interpreted again by the Kremlin as a Western attempt to, to practice regime change with the aim of doing something like that in Russia itself. Then it was, as I mentioned, the protests that started in 2011, 2012 in Russia, the largest protest during Putin's presidency. Well, he was not a president yet. He was re-elected in 2012. And that was again considered that those protests, they could not simply just happen. Okay, we steal elections, but well, whatever. Why do people protest? Of course, the US should have paid them. So there was this reaction, the growing anti-Americanism again in 2012, 2013. And then the adoption of the Magnitsky Act. I will not go into detail about the Magnitsky Act. I will just say that the US adopted the sanctions. They'd imposed sanctions in 2012 on Russia, and that was the first set of sanctions, quite significant sanctions, that the US adopted in relation to Russia. So this created in the Kremlin an atmosphere of a bit panicking. And again, that led to the growth of anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism. Russia reacted to those protests and to those factors by, say, introducing the anti-LGBT law. For example, they forbid the US couples to adopt Russian children. Then they made a huge scandal out of the Pussy Riot concert in one of the Russian major churches to divide the opposition, but also to position Russia as a sort of very conservative country that is trying to preserve some traditional values against the multicultural West. And that was also a period when they started reaching out, not really reaching out, but when they started to agree with some of the attempts of the European far right to come closer to the Russian Federation. Because, as I said, as I mentioned, the far right, the European far right, they were interested in cooperating with Russia already in the 90s. It was just, the Kremlin itself was not very much interested, but it was changed, over several years. And I mentioned that Front National, the French far-right party, received a bank loan of 9 million euros in 2014. And the French case, this case of cooperation with between the Kremlin and the far right, it's quite insightful, and it provides us with a blueprint or a model how they cooperate. So Marine Le Pen, the leader of Front National, it was called Front National then, now it's called the National Rally. In 2011, she became president of this party. And she immediately said that she wanted to go to Moscow, she wanted to meet with someone who's close to Putin, who's close to power, because she almost praised Putin as a strong man, as a real leader who could be a model for the West. But Moscow was not interested. In 2011, they could invite her to Moscow, but she would not be able to meet anyone who would be close to power. The reason was very, very simple. In 2012, there had to be elections in France. And according to the public opinion polls, only two candidates, excluding Marine Le Pen, would be in the second round. That was François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy. And of course, the Kremlin wanted to have good relations with either of them, whoever would be elected. So why would they invite Marine Le Pen, who was in the opposition to both, and give her the sort of protocol that could anger any of the winners of the second round? They waited. In March 2012, Putin was re-elected. In May 2012, Hollande was elected president. And Putin went to France and then to Germany. And in France, in Paris, he was welcomed by François Hollande, who, however, criticized Russia for its support of Assad in Syria. And that was a very important moment when the Kremlin, Putin and his experts, his advisors, realized that President Hollande would not be a good ally of Russia. He would not be working with us on international issues. And in 2012, the Kremlin, people close to the Kremlin, decided, okay, so there is this party that wants to work with us, and they may have a chance of being quite big in the French politics, and this is Front National. Let's work with them. Other French far-right groups also received funding. For example, in 2013, there was a TV station, internet-based TV station, founded by particular far-right activists that was called. It had a very original name. It was called Pro-Russia TV. They were just openly and blatantly promoting the Russian narrative, and they officially cooperated with the Voice of Russia. That was disbanded in 2014, but still in 2013 they were still cooperating, and Pro-Russia TV received around 300,000 euros for 2 years of operation. It was closed down in 2014 because the Voice of Russia ceased to exist, but still it operated for almost 2 years. And also the developing links with Front National. And in the end, 2014, they received money from the first Czech-Russian bank, which had this name Czech-Russian, but in 2014 it was already simply a Russian bank. But Front National basically failed in the elections then, and in 2016, 2017, they wanted to have more money from Russia again. But it was problematic, not from 2015 to 2016, but it was very problematic because, again, the Kremlin looked at the public opinion polls and it saw that, well, Marine Le Pen probably has no chance of winning. And also François Fillon, who was quite friendly towards the Kremlin, was leading the polls. So the Kremlin thought, okay, so why would we support Marine Le Pen if Fillon is leading the polls, and that would be all right for us. So in the second round, we might have Fillon and Le Pen, and it's great. I mean, we are covered. It's a win-win situation. But that was not until Emmanuel Macron became, in the beginning of 2017, he became so popular, and Fillon went down in the polls. And that was the only reason why the Kremlin invited Marine Le Pen, and she officially met with Putin 2 weeks before the first round of the presidential election, to just show that Putin is supporting Le Pen. Le Pen is the candidate. Also in 2016, 2017, there were developments where we see it was no longer the media, cooperation with the media. It was no longer just these electoral observers who would go and rubber stamp some dubious fraudulent elections. That was essentially the Kremlin cooperating with the far right, openly and publicly. 2016, December, the United Russia, Единая Россия, the ruling party in the Russian Federation, signs the cooperation agreement with the Austrian Freedom Party. In April 2017, the same coordination and cooperation agreement is signed between the United Russia and the Italian far-right party called Northern League, which is now has the name just the League or Lega. With the Austrian case, it was very much similar in terms of considerations why the Kremlin decided to do this, and that was very similar to the French case. If you remember 2016, in spring, there were presidential elections in Austria. And for the very first time in the history of Austria after the Second World War, no representative of the two major parties made it to the second round. The major parties in Austria is the People's Party, the Conservatives, and the center-left party, the Social Democratic Party. And none of them, no representative of them, made it to the second round. In the second round, there was Norbert Hofer, the far-right candidate from the Freedom Party of Austria, and Alexander van der Bellen, the politician who was supported by the Green Party. And for Russians, it was quite clear who they would support. There was no major cooperation between Russian actors and the Freedom Party of Austria in the period before those elections. Although the FPÖ, this Freedom Party, they wanted to cooperate with Russian state actors, and they cooperated with minor actors from Russia since at least 2008. But then, okay, they thought, well, all right, so then Norbert Hofer is our candidate, because van der Bellen was quite skeptical about Russia, was quite skeptical about Russia's behavior in starting, of course, predominantly from the annexation of Crimea and the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014. And Hofer was quite fine with the Russian actions. And the idea was, okay, so our partners from the Conservative Party and from the Social Democratic Party, they may be in decline, so let's try the Freedom Party. Norbert Hofer, the representative of the Freedom Party, eventually lost in December, but the decision to sign the cooperation agreement with the FPÖ was taken before the second round of the election in Austria. And again, you see this, well, we want to cooperate with someone who is very, very close to power, and it's very close to the elections. Now it's a very interesting period. Now you have these two parties, the Freedom Party of Austria and the Lega, with whom the United Russia has cooperation agreements. These parties are now in governments. In 2017, the coalition was formed between the Austrian conservatives and this far-right party. And this year, after the elections in Italy, the Five-Star Movement decided to form a governing coalition with the Lega, with Matteo Salvini's party. Before forming those governments, these far-right parties were ones of the most pro-Kremlin parties in the entire European Union. And of course they would say that, well, if we ever come to power, we will lift the sanctions against Russia and we'll go back to business as usual. So that would work for us. It didn't happen. It didn't happen for one very, very simple reason. These parties became so popular, not because they were pro-Kremlin, not because they were pro-Russian, not because they promised to lift the so-called anti-Russian sanctions. They became popular because of the internal dynamics and domestic developments in their countries and Europe as such. They became so popular because of the refugee crisis, of the migration crisis, of the failure of the mainstream establishment forces to deal with the challenges of the fast-changing world. And the ideological principles of those parties, they are not about Russia, but about fighting immigration and increasing law and order, those authoritarian tendencies, struggling with this bureaucratic, corrupt monster of Brussels, as they describe the European Union. And also now they have access to the resources which are far bigger than anything that the Kremlin can offer them. So they are quite pragmatic in this sense too. In the opposition, yes, they would be very much pro-Kremlin. They would go to Moscow. Matteo Salvini, current interior minister, would be taking pictures of himself in a sweatshirt, standing on the Red Square with Putin and saying the army of Putin. So that was fine then. But now, since they are in the government, they are trying to push forward their own domestic agenda rather than international agenda. However, the Kremlin has no choice than to keep supporting all those parties who at least rhetorically promise to change something. And for them, they are playing a longer game. They do believe that the West is waging a war on the Russian Federation, that the West is indeed interested in the regime change in Russia itself. So they will keep looking for allies wherever they come from. And I have a quote from one of the associates of Alexander Dugin. You have probably heard of Alexander Dugin. He's a quite infamous Russian fascist who has been active in this far-right scene since the end of the 1980s. And he is the person who has the network of far-right friends and allies bigger than anyone else in Russia, because he started developing that network already at the end of the 1980s. And one of his associates, and that was 2014, wrote an article which I find quite extreme, and the quote is quite extreme, but I do believe that many other Russian state actors, not other Russian state actors, but Russian state actors, they think along the similar lines, or probably they're not that open in their hatred towards the West, but the quote is this: "Acknowledging the civilizational nature of the conflict between Russia and the West, we aim at destroying the West in its current form as a civilization. Therefore, having recourse to the use of existing networks, we should give priority to those that are themselves directed at the destruction of modern European civilizational identity. Groups that can act in this capacity include totalitarian sects, separatist movements, neo-Nazi and racist movements, anarchists, anti-globalists, radical ecologists, Eurosceptics, isolationists, illegal migrants, etc. This is exactly how the West operates, using against Russia liberal and human rights non-governmental organizations, whose ideology is destructive and pernicious for the Russian civilization." And in this quote, which I again find quite extreme, and I would not expect any Russian officials ever say those words, I think there are three moments that are very, very important. First, the author of that article pointed out that, well, we are not really creating all those problems. We're using the existing problems. And we know that those organizations, those movements, say if we are talking about these racist movements or far-right movements, they're themselves destructive to the West. If you look at how Russia dealt with its own nationalist movement since 2008, most of the leaders of the far-right movement, they are now in jail or killed because they know that nationalism for Russia, not imperialism, but nationalism, is quite destructive. And they are understanding why they are supporting those nationalist movements in the West, because they understand that they are subversive and destructive. And another point is this belief that liberal NGOs and human rights organizations, they are destructive for Russia. Again, this is the acknowledgement of this belief that those people, they truly believe that the West is waging a war on the Russian Federation with the aim of changing the regime. But talking about, and I will soon conclude, talking about the far right itself, the European far right, I want to stress again that Russia may provide political support for those movements, for those parties. They may invite the leaders to meet with Putin to boost the popularity of those organizations, or thinking that they could boost their popularity. They may invite them to the media, to RT and Sputnik. They may amplify those messages that Russian troll factories and botnets can amplify the messages of the European far right, or they can give money to far right parties. But this is not why the far right is growing in Europe. The far right is growing in Europe because of those problems that exist in the Western societies. And the best way to stop Russia from exploiting those problems is to deal with those problems. Of course, this is a midterm and long-term strategy, but still, Russia is looking for vulnerabilities. It's looking for weak places of Western communities, of Western societies. It's exploring the body of the West, trying to find open wounds, and then make those wounds bigger and more painful. And I think this is quite an important idea, that it is essential that the West revitalizes democracy and revitalizes liberalism and make mainstream politicians, establishment politicians, to reconceptualize their own approach towards dealing with the problems that society is talking about. It doesn't necessarily have to be immigration, because the far right can only talk about immigration. But the mainstream figures, the mainstream politicians, should come up with new ideas about how societies can develop in a fair way, in a socially fair way. And just to conclude, and just give you a very, very simple example how the far right is trying to turn everything into the debate about immigration. As you know, yesterday there was a vote in the European Parliament on the situation in Hungary. And Viktor Orban, the day before that, was absolutely annoyed by the forthcoming vote. And that the vote was about the undermining of the rule of law in Hungary. It was about the crackdown on the media, on the civil society in Hungary. But Viktor Orban said, well, the vote is the punishment for Hungary, because we don't want to take any refugees in the country. And I monitored some of the response to that resolution of the European Parliament, and the response from far-right groups. They overwhelmingly supported Viktor Orban, whose party, Fidesz, I believe, is now the major far-right party in Hungary. And again, they all talked that Orban is actually defending Europe against the immigration and refugees. Although it was not, again, the vote was not about refugees or migrants. But the far right are trying, because they have nothing else to talk about. They are trying to turn every discussion into the debate about migration, where they have this hard stance, and they may be quite appealing to these societies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed. And before we proceed with the questions from the audience, I would like to ask one question yourself. I know that you live and work in Vienna, the biggest dance room of Europe, and so you did while writing Tango Noir, researching and recording tango steps. So continuing with the dance team, I would like to ask you, so have you been surprised by the infamous words of Vladimir Putin during the wedding of the Austrian foreign minister, because for many of us, even those who are very knowledgeable of the Russian and Western marriage of convenience, well, it took some of us by surprise.
I was not surprised that Karin Kneissl invited Putin to her wedding party. I was more surprised that Putin was invited to visit Austria in summer before this wedding. Well, officially to celebrate the anniversary of the signing of the gas contract between the Soviet Union and Austria. And that I was really surprised that it happened, that it could happen. And I was even more surprised in July 2014 when it all started to happen in Ukraine. And again, Putin was invited to Austria in July 2014. But because, you know, those developments in July 2014 and then the beginning of summer of this year, I mean, how surprising could be the visit of Putin to the wedding of Mrs. Kneissl? So, no, that was not surprising, and you should take into consideration the quite a special political culture of Austria that sees itself as a bridge between the West and the East. In Vienna, they would say that the Balkans they begin in Vienna on one particular street. So there is nothing surprising. Austria is not a member of NATO, but at the same time, Austria is the country that is largely following the line of Germany. And this is a historical tradition after the Second World War. So symbolically, yes, it was the victory of Vladimir Putin. But if you look at the coverage of this visit in the Austrian media, in the serious Austrian media, not the tabloids, this coverage was quite critical, quite skeptical about why Kneissl would do this and dance with the Russian president.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I don't know, maybe you would like to take a seat. And do we have any questions in the audience? Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is about Dugin. Would you say that, or in your opinion, is a quite relevant figure because he conceived the intellectual framework in which all these kind of events are taking place in the last decade? Or quite on the contrary, you think it's simply a useful, somehow crazy thinker that the Kremlin uses? So you think who influences more to the other? That's my question for you. Thank you.
I'm one of those people who, well, first wrote about Alexander Dugin quite extensively. And my colleagues, Marlene Laruelle and Andreas Umland, we are planning of publishing all our essays and articles on Alexander Dugin under one volume. I don't think that Dugin, especially now, he's such a prominent figure. We know about Alexander Dugin for, well, two particular reasons. One is because he is a Russian ultranationalist who knows several languages and actually reach out to the Western audiences. Because you would not know other people because they may be more influential in terms of, you know, ultranationalist ideology in Russia, but they would just not write in English. So we would not know about them. And then again, the Kremlin used him after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2004-2005, and also after the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014. They used him for the media purposes. They would invite him to the Russian television, state television, to show, and that was like, it's a psychological trick. So what should be shown? That there are so extreme people like Alexander Dugin who wants to conquer Ukraine or even, you know, bomb it or kill all Ukrainians. So in comparison to people like those, Putin would be a moderate. So if some Russian audience, some parts of the Russian audience would think, okay, so probably Putin is quite extreme, probably we should be not doing this. And then you have Alexander Dugin who says, you know, bomb everyone. So you would say, okay, Putin is not extreme, he's fine, yeah, he's doing everything all right. Dugin is important, however, in one particular area. he's a very good networker. As I mentioned, he has been building those contacts since the end of the 1980s. I mean, the Soviet Union was still there, and he was already traveling. He's quite useful in this sense. He's not working directly for the Kremlin. He works for other people. And those other people, they may work for some higher people, and those would be connected to the Kremlin. But this is how it all works in many cases. So you would have people like Dugin who would sell his contacts, you know, up. And those people, for example, like Konstantin Malofeev, for whom Dugin worked for quite a long time. Then Malofeev would try to sell those contacts or some project involving those particular people whom Dugin contacted, you know, higher, you know, to a higher position. So he's one of those people who establish contacts. And you may come up with this comparison. If you need to reach out a particular person in the country and you don't know that person, yeah, you need to find, you know, a network, or you need to find your friend, or the friend of your friend would know that that guy or a woman. This is how networks are established. So Dugin is one of those people, the intermediaries.
Do we have, yes, Ambassador, please, and then Simas.
Thank you very much, Anton. I would admit I haven't yet read your book, but of course after today's enlightening presentation, I am just rushing to see where I can buy this book. On far right, yes, but if you a little bit try to elaborate, I know your book is on the far right, but can you elaborate on the Russia's policy or Russia's context with the left flank of the political sort of establishment, especially knowing that this was particular clients of the Soviet Union, this communist, Comintern, left-wing movements, Communist Party at all. So, how if you would compare, which now the flank is much more of the Russia's interest? Thank you.
It is an interesting question. The particular far-left groups, they are indeed quite fascinated with modern Russia, despite the fact that Russian system is a wild capitalist system that is much worse in the exploitation of the working class than any sort of developed capitalist system. But they like Russia because they think it's anti-globalist. They think because it's anti-American, it's anti-NATO, and it's anti-system. It's against the so-called unipolar world. And these are things that are important for the far left. They would also see, in Russia, they would see an ally in their anti-imperialist struggle, although they would not, of course, understand that Russia is itself might be considered as an imperialist power. Especially given into account the recent developments in Georgia and Ukraine. But you see, there are not very many significant far-left forces in the European Union. Just if you compare the significance of the far left to the significance of the far right, you will see that the far left is quite in decline. Die Linke, this left party in Germany, it's not that important. If you look at the public opinion polls, Die Linke is having it's much less popular than the Alternative for Germany. The difference between is just staggering. You can also look at the Podemos, this far left movement in Spain, but again, it's not that significant. There was a lot of talk, and I must admit I was sort of panicking myself when Syriza, the far-left party in Greece, came to power and formed a coalition with the far-right party called Independent Greeks. So I thought, well, okay. And the series of leaders, they would go to Moscow in 2013, and they would meet with people like Leonid Reshetnikov, who at that time was the head of one of the pro-Kremlin strategic think tanks in Moscow. But again, what happened to them? They came into power, and now they have expelled 2 Russian spies. So it's not that successful, I mean, this strategy. Of course, they would still try to use any opportunity. Like, as I said, and I quoted, I cited this, they would, any problem, you know, any extreme measure, any radical organization, extreme group, they would try to use them. But it's, the success rate is very, very low. And I think it's higher with the far right, because just the far right is bigger in Europe.
Okay, Anton, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I would like to link your insights to what was previously said in the 3 panels before. And since we are searching for the best practices in fighting Kremlin's disinformation, I would like to ask you, do you think that the EU and separate national governments should somehow differentiate their approach to Kremlin's disinformation and far-right's disinformation, because far-right movements are also in this business? Or do you consider it just the same big ecosystem and that we should, you know, do not need any differentiation between these 2 movements?
No, there is even sort of legal differentiation. Because if there is an interference from the Russian side, this is foreign interference in the domestic affairs. If you see that the far right is trying to promote its own views, I mean, it's legitimate. If they are not breaking the law, everything they say is legitimate. And their participation in the domestic politics is normal. I mean, this is what democracy is about. It's about competition of different political ideas and doctrines and policies. So, again, for me, it's a legal distinction. For me, it's a legal difference. The spread of conspiracy theories, for example, it's a different topic. But this is where we should look closer at the workings of the media, of the mainstream media, because sometimes they also failing to deliver what is expected from them. Yeah.
So maybe we have one more last before the last questions. I think that you have a very thorough presentation, so that's the answer. So, and you have almost mentioned that during your presentation, that EU and especially mainstream political forces in member states should focus on their problems inside, the ones that hurt most, because Russia is best at capturing that wound and exploiting it for their needs. So, since we're looking for practical solutions, so this is one very practical one, and would you have another 2 for European Union as organization, how to tackle disinformation and how to save themselves from the growing amount of it?
Well, I can't really comment on how to fight disinformation. This is something that I did not look into much detail. But you see, in the recent years, and this is not something new, I would say even maybe in the last 1-2 decades, the mainstream parties, they became not too much different from each other. The center-right and the center-left, while during the Cold War, after the Second World War, there was a real war between the center-right and the center-left. But now they all converged in the center, and there is not much difference for them. And for many people, for many societies, the real alternative to this amalgamation of the center-right and center-left became the far-right. or political forces such as the movement of Macron. He managed to capture this moment when you can be pro-European on the one hand and anti-establishment on the other. And this also may be a real alternative. You know, it doesn't have to be far right all the time. Or again, the victory of Alexander van der Bellen in the presidential elections in Austria. He was coming from the Green Party. It's a very small party that actually is now destroyed in Austria. But he brought some new views into the political discussions. So I think the best way. So basically, if all the mainstream converges in the center, then the far right have a huge window of opportunity, have a huge space to develop. They become an alternative mainstream. They become this real political alternative for many of the voters. So I think the best way is, again, revitalize not necessarily the conflict between the center right and the center left, but to revitalize the language of liberal democracy. You know, bring up new ideas. What else can we talk about except for immigration? Because everybody's talking about immigration, and this is why the far right is winning. Because every time you start talking about immigration, you have a far right person who's a radical, and people applaud him or her. This is not the way how political discussions should develop. They should involve other issues. Social equality is such a huge thing. Why nobody is trying to offer new solutions to the problem with the social equality.
Thank you very much, and I really do hope that soon we will have Tango Noir in Lithuanian. That would be a great gift for all those who don't speak English, or even if they do, to have it in Lithuanian would be great. And thanks once again for coming and your great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.